Please join me now in welcoming David Cay Johnston.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlton, very much. Well, I'm glad you're all here today, even if it was for extra credit. I want to talk to you about things that may be a little jarring. You may not have heard them, so try to keep your mind very open about things. What American republic do we live in? The first, the second, the third, the fifth? Anybody know? We live in the second. The first American republic, the Articles of Confederation government, failed because it lacked two crucial powers that define a government: the power to tax and the power to regulate commerce. The next time you see any of the Star Wars movies, long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, pay attention to what scrolls by on the screen, that homage to 1930s movie serials, and you will see that the entire 6 episodes plus the 3 new ones they're going to make are motivated by taxes and trade. In fact, if you had come here from another planet, maybe there's somebody in the room who did, and you were the head of the economics team, and you were told before the aliens were going to come here to write a report in hierarchical fashion, you would probably begin your report with these words: the people who call themselves human beings and their planet Earth apparently love more than anything taxes. 40% of their worldwide economic activity is taxes, and nothing else comes close. Not war, not food, nothing comes close to taxes. Without taxes, there is no civilization. Whether you grew up in a household where you struggled and your parents worried about whether they could feed you well enough, or you grew up and got handed the keys to a nice car on your 16th birthday, the only reason that we have wealth and we have liberty is because of taxes. And yet we have allowed our political leaders and some very greedy people to turn tax into the most vile 4-letter word in American politics. In ancient Athens, 2,500 years ago, if you were lucky enough to live there, you lived in the most civilized paradise on earth. Now, the Indians who lived over on the Olympic Peninsula and in the South Pacific and on the California shore, they had a pretty good life. But they didn't have highly developed cultures. In Athens, you had theater. You had plays, some of which you probably have had to study in school already. You had running water. And the Athenians, when they came up with the idea 2,500 years ago of democracy, of one man, one vote, an early democracy for sure, because it was only men. When they came up with this idea, they confronted a problem. The rich had always run Athens, just as the rich had run everywhere else. And how were they to bring together these ideas of someone had great riches and expected to tell the government what to do and control the government, and one person has one vote? And the answer they came up with was this: in man's natural state, that's in the jungle, where there is an endless war of all against one and one against all, where the tiger eats whatever he wants, and the mouse, if he can't scurry away, ends up being dinner. There is no wealth, there is no liberty, there is no property, there is no Athens. And therefore, the greater the wealth you manage to attain, whether it's through luck or inheritance or hard work or smart business dealings, the greater the burden you owe to Athens, so that Athens will endure and others in the future will have the same opportunities that you had. And when they came up with that idea, they began to make democracy work. Democracy and taxation based on ability to pay, progressive taxation, are completely intertwined ideas. They are the civil twins of Western civilization. And the oldest surviving idea in Western civilization is the moral basis of progressive taxation. Rich as you got rich because you lived in Athens. If you'd lived in the jungle, you wouldn't be rich. And as a result of that idea, which has been supported by every single classic worldly philosopher, Aristotle, Plato, Adam Smith, who was the one who explained to us market economics, Jeremy Bentham, all the way on through. In fact, George W. Bush has proclaimed repeatedly, I made our tax system more progressive, and supports this moral principle. Well, the reality is that's not how our tax system works in America anymore. And what you hear politicians in America and pundits on TV say about tax is by and large only occasionally and incidentally related to reality. We live in an incredibly unequal society. I could have put up here a chart of the level of inequality among modern countries, the 34 modern countries of the world, but I can tell you what it would say. It would show most of the countries of the world running along here, and the US would be up here. And our neighbors up here in this zone of extreme inequality, they would be Brazil, China, Mexico, Russia, and Venezuela. They wouldn't be Canada, Europe, Australia, Japan, New Zealand. We are developing an economy that is much more like that of Brazil. And in Rio de Janeiro, where I was a little over a year ago, very, very wealthy people are so afraid that they no longer travel across the city in armored vehicles with bodyguards in front and back of their cars. They fly in helicopters. You think about whether you want to live in a society like that. So Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, I quote him. He wrote one of the chapters for the book that you saw up there, which is an anthology. It has 44 chapters, 44 contributors to it, about all the aspects of inequality, not just incomes, but education, environmental hazards, workplace hazards, food, the quality of junior colleges, the environment you live in. All of those things are covered. Joe is one of the contributors, and Joe says, American inequality didn't just happen, it was created. In fact, and this is the most important thing you need to know when you leave college, you will decide not only your future, but the future of the country. My generation, the boomers, we haven't done a very good job. When I was 18 years old, I was recruited by one of the biggest and best newspapers in America to be a reporter. I never worried about finding work. Nobody I knew around me, if you were willing to work, worried in the 60s and the 70s about finding a job. There were employers all over eager to hire you. Any of you worried about finding a job when you graduate? Yeah, you should be. You should be. It doesn't have to be that way. The whole idea of the United States of America is we will solve our own problems. We have a constitution that enshrines the ownership of human beings in numerous ways. We got rid of that. 638,000 people had to die to get rid of it, 38,000 of them black Americans, but we got rid of it. Women got back the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony spent her entire life on it. She died saying it is inevitable, or allegedly saying it is inevitable. And in 1920, we finally got a constitutional amendment, and women got the right to vote. More than 100 years ago, when children were working in factories, when in fact most of you, 120 years ago, would have at the age of 6 been working in a factory 12 hours a day. And if you lost a leg or a foot or something, well, too bad. You ended up starving to death if you didn't die from infection. There were ministers who would say, those who favor child labor laws are the agents of the devil, for it is God's plan that these children work in the factories. Well, we got child labor laws. We got unions. We got, under a Republican president, some terrific environmental laws. And we have been throwing all of this away for the last 35 years. Let me give you a good example of this. How would you like it if you went to work and the taxes that are withheld from your paycheck didn't go to the government, they went to your boss? That sound like a good idea to you? No? 3,000 companies get to do this. They include all the big automakers, Goldman Sachs, the biggest firm on Wall Street, Deutsche Bank, big German bank, very active in subverting the American economy and selling illegal tax shelters. communist Chinese companies. Rupert Murdoch's company, Fox News, gets this deal. They get to keep the state income taxes withheld from their workers' paychecks. Now, imagine for a moment you decide to go into a business and your competitor gets this deal and you don't. Who's an accounting student? What's going to happen to you over time if your competitor gets this deal and you don't?
Phase out of the competition.
You're going to go broke. That's right. It's going to destroy you. Our government is picking winners and losers. And you know the most brilliant thing about this? It was done so quietly. It started in 1989 in Kentucky. It was done so quietly that there were no news reports about it until 2011. The workers do not know. They're not told because once the paycheck, your money's withheld from the paycheck, you've paid your taxes. And the position of the state governments was, well, I'm sorry, whatever taxes are paid by the company are confidential. It's none of your business. General Electric, the only company I know of that's ever told its workers, although I've interviewed some of them and it's clear they didn't understand whatever it is they were told. General Electric will get 92% of the cost of modernizing an aviation factory in Ohio from its own workers' taxes. Now, if General Electric can earn an 8% return on that investment, and I would expect they would do that or better, that means their annual return on their shareholders' money is how much? 100%. 100% annual return. The workers don't know, the company gets this tax credit, and in a couple of the states, by the way, here's how smart they were. Assume, let's say, a union figured this out and decided to tell everybody, withhold zero or virtually zero from your paycheck. Now, the law is written in a way that says that if you then wrote a check to the state in January for your taxes, it would go to the company. They figured that out as a possibility. Now, how about Cabela's? Anybody here go hunting and fishing? Ever been to Cabela's? Well, you know how Cabela's and Bass Pro build their stores? With your tax dollars. In Hamburg, Pennsylvania, the city fathers of Hamburg, who had a very nice, well-run little store that sold hunting and fishing equipment owned by a local guy named Jim Weeknecht, who if you went into his store and said, well, I'm not from around here, you know, where's the best place to catch trout? Or where do I want to go look to shoot deer so I actually bring one home? He could tell you. Cabela's came to town and the town fathers gave them $32 million. Does that number mean anything to you? Here's how much money it is. For the same amount of money, the city council could have bought every family in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, a brand new Honda Accord with a 6-cylinder engine, a premium sound system, and leather seats, and paid full retail. Well, guess what? Jim Weeknecht made his living underselling Cabela's. Somebody'd look at a hunting bow for $600 and say, oh, I'm not so sure. And he would say, well, let me show you something. He'd get the Cabela's catalog out and he'd say, they charge $649. He went broke. In the first 3 years that Cabela was a publicly traded company, the deals they made for subsidies equaled 137% of their profits. In other words, they didn't make a single dollar in the marketplace. It came entirely from the taxpayers. And the money, how did they get it? Well, at Cabela's and Bass Pro and a lot of Walmarts and Lowe's, and in some places in America, entire shopping centers. You go to the cash register to pay your bill, and they tack on the sales tax, whatever it is, the store owners get to keep it. They get to keep it. It doesn't go to pay for schools. It doesn't go to pay for libraries. It doesn't go to pay for police or for fire. Now think about that. Imagine you run a business that doesn't get that deal. In fact, it gets better than that. Typically, one of these companies will come to town and say, we'd like to build on that corner. And we had somebody as a front try to buy it, and the guy wants way too much money. We want you to use the city's power of eminent domain to take the land from that person. Now, under the Constitution and the Fifth Amendment, we have to pay you what's called just compensation. I'll tell you what just compensation is a synonym for in America. Deeply discounted. You'll get 25 cents on the dollar on average. You might get as little as 15. And then the government owns the land. The government contracts with the person you tell to build the building. They finance it all with municipal bonds. They pay back the bonds with the sales tax money. Lowe's had a store like this in West Virginia, and when they paid off the bonds, a little earlier than they thought it, after 7 years, they closed the store in the middle of the night one night, pulled up a bunch of 18-wheelers, and moved everything to the next town over. And this town was left with an empty store. How'd you like to compete against somebody who hits the city government to build their store for them? Does that sound like market economics or capitalism? It's called, I call it anyway, corporate socialism, and it is the dominant form of doing business in America today. Oh, come on, there we go. Oh, my little cash register, I should have forgotten that. How about a penny? A penny's not very much, right? If your boss said, I'll give you a penny a day raise, you wouldn't stay at a job for a penny, right? Imagine if you could get the government to have a law, or maybe just a rule, a regulation, doesn't even have to go before Congress, that every person in America has to give you a penny every day. You have any idea how much money you'd have? I learned about this because when I was a little boy, the Giants came to San Francisco. They moved across country, and my father, who was a 100% disabled veteran, was given 2 tickets. He didn't care about baseball, but my mother was a baseball fanatic, and she took me. And I was so pestering about Willie Mays and who's this and who's that. She said, you know, why don't you figure out how much money you'd have if you could get everybody here to give you a nickel? And I spent the next 6 or so innings calculating in my head and counting up how many seats there were. And by kind of picking a nickel, of course, she picked an odd number. And then I told her somewhere near the end of the game what it was, and my mother folds back the program to show that it has how many seats are in the stadium. And I almost hit it on the head, though. I said, I recall $1,100, and it was something right in that neighborhood. And she said, but the question wasn't really how much money you'd have. It was how would you get these people to give you the nickel? Well, if you could get a penny a day from everybody in America at the end of the year, you'd have just under $1.2 billion. Anybody here like to have $1.2 billion? So, how do you get it? Well, the pipeline companies get it. The oil and gas pipelines. Companies like, that Canadian firm Keystone, if they get to build their pipeline. How do they do this? Well, utility companies. Now, you have in Washington State mostly public power, but most of America has corporate-owned power. So electric utilities, gas utilities, water utilities, telephone utilities, pipelines, all operate under a privilege from the government, a grant, a monopoly grant, a right to operate without competition. And their rates, therefore, are set by the government under a legal principle called just and reasonable. The customers are entitled to just and reasonable prices, and the owners are entitled to just and reasonable profits. And the doctrine is that $1 more of profit than just and reasonable has to be disgorged because there is no fuzz here. It's a clear line. Well, the tax is 35%. So if you make $1 billion profit, you pay $350 million. That's not how it works. Instead, they have a grossed up tax. The government says you should be able to make $1 billion profit. So that means $350 million to pay the taxes. Well, wait a minute. Now you got to pay a $100 million tax on the $350 million extra we gave you to have the taxes. And then we got to give you another $35 million to cover the $35 million. By the time you get through adding it all up, the tax rate becomes 54%. So to give you a $1 billion profit, you have to collect from your customers $1.54 billion, and it will net you $1 billion. All right, that's the way it works. That's the math. You just got to bear the cost of it, folks. It's too bad, except for one little thing. Whoops. How about that one? You are forced, every time you buy gasoline for your car, you turn on the stove to boil water for coffee or oatmeal, you're paying a tax to these companies that's embedded in the rates you pay, and they don't pay the tax. They're exempt from it. Well, the consumers, the direct consumers in this case, ExxonMobil and British Petroleum among them, took the federal agency that allowed this, a little tiny agency that journalists don't cover, except maybe me, to court back in the the early 1990s, when the first oil man in American history was President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. By the time the case was settled, many years had gone by, and it went before a very conservative judge in the District Court of Appeals in Washington named David Sentel, and he wrote an opinion that said, you can't do that. You can only charge actual expenses. I mean, if we let you make up a fictitious charge, and this is my words, not his, we could just do this endlessly, and it would make the whole principle of just and reasonable meaningless. Well, by the time this happened, the second Texas oil man was in the White House. And he and his vice president, the actual head of a very big oil company called Halliburton, appointed people from the industry to this federal regulatory agency. And they came up with something new in the law. A federal regulatory agency, or a state one, is a court. And, you know, the prosecutor doesn't get to talk to the judge without the defense there. If you're suing someone, you can't talk to the judge and keep the other side, the person you're seeking money from, out of the judge's chambers. So they invented something they called a policy statement. And under a policy statement, there was no case. They were just talking about policy. And the only people they met with came from the pipeline industry, and they had lots of meetings. And once they had reached agreement on how to do this, they announced, we now are going to have a rate case. All parties have 15 days to file. They can file one brief of 15 pages. There will be no follow briefs. There will be no testimony. Guess what they did in 15 days later? They put back in, you got to pay the tax in the rates, even though they're exempt. Well, they got taken back to court by Exxon and BP, and this time it went to the same judge, David Sentel, who said, I don't know why we're talking about taxes and all of this. I mean, this just doesn't seem right. It seems to complicate things. Why don't you just set a rate of return that's after tax and not worry about it and make it their problem? But you know what? Since you explained your reasoning this time with a policy statement, you can keep the money. You can keep the money. Now, I want to start a movement. I want to know how many people want you to stand up, are willing to sign a petition, go around and collect signatures, demonstrate in the streets, get arrested by the cops. We're going to fight the 3 penny a day ripoff. Oh. Well, you know what? 3 pennies a day for this industry, and $1 a day for that industry, and $5 a day for somebody else, and pretty soon, you're poor and a handful of people are super rich. And by the way, investing in an oil company won't do you any good, in a pipeline company, because the managers shave off this money for themselves. Even the investors don't get the benefit of it. So we pay billions of dollars to the pipeline companies, to retailers, not all retailers, just the ones that get the deal, that never get to government, which means, of course, your tax burden's higher than it would seem. Now, how about alchemy? You know, in medieval times, there was a great effort to help get the king rich by coming up with the philosopher's stone, that's Harry Potter's version of it, that would magically turn lead into gold. And imagine how rich you could be if you could turn lead into gold. Vast sums of money, one of the great scams of all times by people who were quote-unquote chemists, that is, alchemists. Well, we actually have modern alchemy that's vastly more profitable and workable. It's called accounting. And it has this magical property that turns red ink black, and it takes the burden of taxes and converts them from an expense into a source of profit. There are 6 words that were added to the tax code in 1986 that are worth $100 million each, at a minimum. At a minimum, $100 million each. They're in Section 532, and they refer to Section 531. Here's what the section said before 1986, in part. The accumulated earnings tax imposed by Section 531 shall apply to every corporation formed for the purpose of avoiding the income tax. Tens of thousands of small business owners were forced over the years to pay a penalty tax, most of those years 20%. So if you had to pay a 35% tax today and there was a 20% penalty tax, you'd have to pay a 55% tax because you kept too many earnings. The law applied to everybody, but it was never applied to big industrial companies. It was applied to people who, you know, if your grandfather had gotten a McDonald's franchise on the right street corner in Seattle in 1960, you think you might have come to school over here in Daddy's private jet? Well, here's what they added. other than those described in Section B. And Section B then says, in effect, if you siphon the money out of the United States. So here's what happens. Every time Nike sells a pair of shoes with that swoosh, Nike pays a royalty from Nike, Portland, Oregon, over to Nike, owner of the swoosh patent in some tax haven somewhere, and gets a tax deduction. They move the money from the left pocket to the right. Well, I'm going to do that. Do I get a tax deduction for this? No. But they do. And so do Hilton Hotels and Pfizer, all sorts of companies. And once that money is offshore, through paying dollars to your own subsidiary, it's as if your parents could give you money, just as a subsidiary, as a corporate child. Your parents could give you money and get a deduction for it. You think they might give you a little more money? Those profits are never subject to tax, so long as they stay offshore, and actually they don't have to stay there. You just call up JP Morgan Bank and say, hey, listen, we got $1 billion sitting here in the Cayman Islands. There's nothing to do with it. You know, there's people at the beach, and there's no business activity here except tourists. Why don't you buy us some federal debt? After all, Congress, it turns out, is selling debt because it didn't raise enough taxes. So you do that, and let's say that you earn 4% for 30 years. At the end of 30 years, you'll have $3.2 billion. And you decide now, well, I'm going to pay this tax. I'm going to pay this $1 billion tax. By the way, there's no inflation adjustment. There's no interest on the tax. So that tax now is really worth to the government maybe $450 million or so, less than half. And you will end up, I'm sorry I did this wrong, it's not on the screen, but you'll end up with $2.2 billion in your account, and you paid your tax. You ever heard the phrase, you can't eat your cake and have it too? Oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. Now, if you have a purely domestic company, my oldest son and I, third of my 8 children, we created a business. We don't get this deal because we're a purely domestic business. You have to be an international business to do this, which really means you got to be big. And little guys like us, we don't get to do that, or I should say like him, since he retired me not long ago. So now let's look at what's happened. This is wealth in America. Many years ago, I was the first journalist to write about an economist named Dan Ariely. Dan Ariely is a behavioral economist. I became interested in him because I went to the University of Chicago. I arrived there as a 24-year-old young man going, these people have figured it out. And I left 2 semesters later going, these people live in space because human beings don't behave the way they do. There are these incredibly elegant theories on paper that I was old enough to look at and say, that's not how the world works. People don't behave that way. People don't go around saying, oh my goodness, if I earn an extra $1 and I'm 62 years old and I've already started taking Social Security, that last $1 will be taxed at 91%. But as soon as I get $1,000 beyond that, my tax rate will fall back to 15%. People don't even know stuff like that. Why would they change their behavior? And furthermore, if you need the $1, you're going to work to get it anyway. So Dan Ariely came up with this brilliant idea. He had people, all sorts of people, go to the internet, and they were asked to describe what they believed was the distribution of wealth in America, what they thought was the ideal distribution of wealth in America, and then they were shown reality. So here's what people thought would be the ideal. And I want you to notice here, there are 5 quintiles, right? The assumption here is that the bottom 2 quintiles, that's 120 million of your fellow Americans, they had 25% of the wealth. And the top quintile, the top 20%, that's everybody makes over $75,000 a year. That's all you have to make to get in the top quintile, $75,000 a year. They would own a little over, just about a third. Okay, now we'll go to the next one. Here's what people estimated actually was what happened in America. And you'll notice it's not a great deal different. I mean, people understood that the richest people in America had a lot more wealth. They figured close to 60%. And the bottom 2 quintiles here, they had just under 10%. Not 25%, but just under 10. So less than people thought they should have at the bottom, the poor. Here's reality. By the way, you notice there's only 3 colors up there? You know why? The poorest 60 million Americans own 1/10 of 1% of the wealth. And the next poorest 60 million Americans own 2/10 of 1% of the wealth. They're twice as rich. And altogether, they own, 120 million of us, they own 3/10 of 1% of the wealth. And by the way, this was not skewed by people's views. Notice here that Bush voters, this was their estimate. It's not much different than anybody else's of how much the rich had or how much they thought people at the bottom would have. Here is the ideal system, Bush voters. Men, women, Kerry voters. The reality of how our economy has affected the shape of our wealth and our incomes is not at all what people understand. And the reason for that is that a small handful of people have distorted and shaped things. Now, when I was a little younger than you, when I was in high school in the 1960s, out of nowhere came a Harvard-educated lawyer named Ralph Nader. And he started telling people that automobiles were killing people left and right. They were cutting their carotid arteries, they were leaving them paralyzed, they were impaling them on steering wheels, they had knobs that left people in wheelchairs for the rest of their life, and that all the engineers in Detroit knew how to build better cars, but nobody would do it. And by the way, if we could just put seat belts in cars, we'd save lots of lives. General Motors responded to this by hiring a very attractive woman who walked up to him in the Safeway store and tried to talk him up. And later they admitted, yes, they'd hired a prostitute to try and get film of him they could use to discredit him. General Motors. Well, the Chamber of Commerce of the US hired a very, very smart lawyer from Virginia, a friend of my father-in-law named Lou, or a somewhat friend, named Lewis Powell, and said, what do we do about this? And you can go on the internet and read the Powell memo. In fact, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's a brilliant, brilliant memo. And what it says is, we have to bring the consumer groups and the news media and the academy, that is the professors, and anybody else who criticizes big business to heel, or we can't run the country. And right after that, the Cato Institute was formed, a charity owned by 2 guys in Wichita named Koch, and Heritage Foundation were formed. And they began putting out all sorts of studies that basically said, do these things for the wealthiest people in America, and you'll all be better off. It turns out the founders of our country anticipated this. They wrote at great length about this. They were extremely concerned because, remember, they had started a revolution against the aristocrats, the inherited wealth, the people who were the royalty who told you what to do. It, after all, was only 500 years ago that if the king's soldier walked up and you said the wrong thing and he slit your throat, he got a pay raise. Even if, actually, the comment you were making was about her. This was a really radical thing they did. And the leaders of the revolution in this country, by and large, were the wealthiest people in America. They were largely business people, and many, but not all of them, were extremely well educated. They knew about ancient Athens. So the principal author of the Constitution of the United States is President James Madison, later became President James Madison. We must prevent an immodest and especially unmerited accumulation of riches. If you had been born in France in the late 18th century, your station in life would have been determined in an instant, at the moment of conception, based on who you picked as your parents, which gender you picked for yourself, and your birth order. And if you didn't pick rich, male, and first, too bad for you. As we all know, of course, things in France ended that century on a rather sharp note. President John Adams warned that a business aristocracy born of inequality, that is, your parents are rich and you're going to become part of the business aristocracy. This business aristocracy would arise and manipulate the votes, and especially people who lacked either capital for their own tools or land. In New Jersey, you know what they call the county supervisors? Freeholders. You couldn't vote unless you held land free and clear. This was a widely held belief at the time. If you were a wage worker, you would be manipulated by those you worked for. Adams wrote that unless constrained by law, what he called the silent operation of law without violating the rights of property, In time, we would end up in which the rich and the proud would destroy the equality and the liberty of this country. What he worried about was that people who didn't have any property, like those 120 million Americans, would believe what the wealthy told them was needed by the government to do so they would be better off when in fact they were slitting their own throats economically. I would argue that's exactly what we've been doing in this country for the last 35 years. I can't tell you how many people I have interviewed who've told me that if their boss doesn't get a tax cut, they fear they won't have a job. When we had much higher tax rates, we had much better jobs and many more jobs. And here's one of the reasons. The second year or the third year we were in business, my son called me up the day after Christmas. He said, "Dad, I made a mistake." I'm like, "Oh." And he says, "We made $20,000 more profit than I thought," which is a big number for the size of our business. And I said, "Oh, well, okay, just pay yourself a bonus or put it in your retirement plan, fine." He said, "Well, actually, I have a different idea." And I'm thinking, ugh. And he says, "You know, we've been spending a lot of money on a print shop for our brochures. I found this $20,000 photocopier printer I want to buy, and then we can do it in-house." Well, we bought it, and what it meant was the government paid a third of the cost because it was a tax-deductible expense. And that machine we still have years later, and it has made us a ton of money. And that's what people did when they had high tax rates. They reinvested in the business. And when you reinvest in the business, you have to create jobs to make that investment worthwhile. But if you can withdraw from the business and say, you know, 9 mansions just isn't enough. We should buy one next door to the one on the beach in Hawaii. You are effectively destroying jobs. You know, you can end up like Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson owns 2 private 747s, one of which he has out-equipped for skateboarding in the sky by his youngest heirs. That's in my book, The Fine Print. So we live in the Second American Republic. The first one failed because it had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, and had no stated purpose. The very first power we grant Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts. That Constitution came out shortly before Edmund Burke, the great European jurist and philosopher, wrote the letter that founded the modern conservative movement. And in that letter he said, the revenue of the state is the state. If you have feeble revenues, you have a feeble state. And remember that visitor from outer space I started with? One of the things that visitor would note is, you know, the countries that pay the most taxes have the richest people. There's a couple of exceptions, but overall, the higher the taxes, the richer people are. Why would that be? Because the creation of private wealth is built on a foundation of commonwealth. If you don't have roads to move stuff down the highway smoothly and quickly, if you don't have dams to collect water so you have it readily available in both times of drought and times when there's too much water and you need to hold it back, if you don't have an education system that produces trained, competent, skilled people who can add value, if you don't have a judicial system to adjudicate disputes, a police system to enforce court orders, and all the other things that constitute the functions of government, you can't have wealth creation. And if you doubt that, you know, I've traveled in many of the poorest countries of this world. You go to a place like Honduras, and what you see is poverty everywhere. So, we have our purpose of our country written down for us in the preamble to the Constitution. There are 6 noble purposes for this country. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that took until 1865 and those 635,000 dead people to achieve, but we got there. To establish justice, that's what civilization is. The jungle has no justice. Civilization is justice. To provide, to ensure domestic tranquility, that was basically a promise to put down slave revolts. To provide for the common defense, duh. To promote the general welfare, and that W is capitalized in the original. To promote the general welfare. It doesn't mean making welfare payments to people, it means the reason we created this government is so people will be better off. And to secure the blessings of liberty. You can't have liberty if you don't have a functioning government that can make sure your liberties are protected. President Adams said the goal of our nation is not the enrichment of the already rich, it is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. President Franklin Roosevelt said we do not measure a society by how much better off we have made the rich. It's by how much we have alleviated those who are in need of our assistance. Now, a couple of quick things. This is what's happened to labor's share of the economy. The economy produces growth. It can only go two places. It either goes to labor or it goes to capital. The government has two measures that aren't quite matched, so I want to make sure you see both of them, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the National Income and Product Accounts. By the way, you want to do somebody doing a paper, a key reason we won World War II so quickly was we had the National Income and Product Accounts. Statistics was very important to defeating the Nazis, people who made my father disabled. You'll notice that this has just been falling off. The share of the growth in the economy going to labor. In fact, the average income of the bottom 90% of Americans in the year 2011 was $59 more than in 1966 when I was in high school. Any of you think next year if you got $5 a month more you'd notice? This is 45 years later, adjusted for inflation, $5 a month more. Like, imagine we're going to count that as 1 inch. You're going to create a graphic. $59 is 1 inch. How'd the top 10% do? Well, they came up, we're here on the second floor to where my feet are, above my head, through the ceiling, 160 some feet. How'd the top 1% do? They started about $380,000 a year, a little over $1,000 a day. 884 feet. But that's totally and completely misleading, because so much of the gains went to one other group, the 1% of the 1%, the 16,000 best off households in America, a group that Mitt Romney is near the bottom of, a group that George W. Bush has never been in. Well, 1 year he was in. 5 miles. And by the way, those people's taxes have been cut 60%, and the 90% are paying essentially the same taxes they paid in 1966. If you have a surplus income and you cut taxes, you have more and more and more to invest. That's how you get rich. And it's a snowball. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Not all incomes are down. This is corporate profits. And you'll notice that terribly sharp 1 year drop, 2009. If you had the most successful, profitable business around, but like any big business, you knew, we got this division that's kind of, I've been hanging on to it, it's a disaster. These assets that are impaired, we've just never got. That was the year you took it, because nobody cared. Everybody knew it was terrible. But look what's happening to profits. And by the way, since then, it's continued to go up, straight up like a rocket. Unbelievable record profits in America. Now, a budget tells you what you love. What we love in America is Wall Street. We risked $14.7 trillion bailing out Wall Street. Wall Street needed a bailout because of easily committed and easily provable crimes. Falsifying mortgage documents, sending them through the mails, transmitting money over the wires, and memos saying, we don't care what the law says, go ahead and do it. Thousands of them. There should be thousands of these bankers in jail, just as there were 882 of them who went to jail in the savings and loan episode in 1992, which was so much smaller, the Wall Street scandal, 175 times bigger. You know how many people went to jail compared to the 882 back then? 0. President Obama and Eric Holder will not prosecute these people. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with their careers after they leave office. But here's what we did in the bailout. $14.7 trillion. That, by the way, is the entire output of the entire American economy for the year 2009. Right now, we're at about a $17 trillion economy. So that much money would pay for the Women, Infant, and Children's Nutrition Program for 2,261 years. Do we love poor children? We want to make sure they get a good diet in the womb so they don't grow up to be morons? Or do we love Wall Street bankers? Pell Grants for college students, 433 years of Pell Grants. We love you guys or Wall Street? Your politicians made this choice, and they've all been reelected. The number of people in this country paying no taxes keeps going up. Congress has been counting it for years. A 0.6%, or every 162nd person in this country who made over $200,000 in 2009, and the number has gone up since then. We just don't have the official report yet. Keeps rising. People who make a lot of money and pay no taxes. Now, the government does an annual report on the 400 highest tax returns. That's not the 400 highest incomes. Because very, very rich people, they don't report any income. Imagine just for a moment that you suddenly found out that Uncle Mary or Aunt Jane you never heard of has left you $1 billion. And if you're smart, the first thing you're going to do is go see an accountant who really deals with rich people, or a lawyer, and you're going to say, what do I do? And they're going to say, well, we're going to buy you a very diversified portfolio that pays no dividends, and you're going to borrow against the billion, and you'll never pay taxes again. And if you spend $10 million on your lifestyle this year, the bank's going to want $200,000 of interest. At the end of the year, you'll owe back $200,000, which you're not going to pay. You're going to roll it over because your fortune will have grown 5% to $1,050,000,000, and your net worth now is $1,040,000,000. And you're going to get richer and richer and richer and never pay taxes. Well, in 2009, the average income of the 400 highest people who had to file on a tax return, $202 million, and 6 of them paid no income tax, and about 50 of them paid under 10%. The next year, we just got this data, the top group's income went up 31%. 31%, but look what happened to their tax rate. Fell 10%. Call your parents up and ask them if they got a 10% tax cut from 2009 to 10. The average tax rate these people paid was 18%. Well, if you're a single person, no children, no dependents, no husband or wife, and you made the median wage, which has been stuck since 1998, when you were all in diapers, since 1998 at a little over $500 a week, your total federal tax burden, which is your income taxes, the Social Security tax withheld from your check, and the other half of Social Security, which is not an employer contribution, it's wages you earned that were taxed away at a rate of 100%. Your total tax rate is more than 21%. Using the same measure for this other group, it doesn't change because it's insignificant. It's 18%. That means that the richest people in America that year, they worked every Monday till about 3:30 or 3:45 in the afternoon to pay their taxes. But a median wage worker had to work all of Monday and a half an hour of Tuesday to pay their taxes. That's not the wealthier you get because you live in Athens, the greater the burden you should bear. It is, in fact, what tyrannies do. Now, I'm going to back up for a second. George Bush, when he ran for office in the year 2000, a few things you need to know about him. He had been a tax shelter salesman, oil and gas tax shelters, which requires detailed knowledge of both tax law and the engineering issues and geology of oil and gas. He failed. Then he became the general partner of a baseball team called the Texas Rangers. And the Texas Rangers were run through a deal like the kind I've been telling you about, land seized with eminent domain, and a taxpayer subsidy of $202.5 million. When the team was sold, it was sold for a profit of $164 million, which means they left $38 million on the table. And they never made a penny in the marketplace. And President Bush, then candidate Bush, ran for office and said, elect me and cut taxes the way I want, and you will all be better off. Well, in the fall of 2000, the stock market had already started to fall. I was at the New York Times. I called the Bush campaign and said, you guys want to hedge your bets a little bit? I mean, you're going around saying we're in the Al Gore recession, and if we're in a recession, incomes are going to go down, people's businesses are going to fail, and it'll take a couple of years till we're back on track. Who's your editor? The executive editor of the New York Times phone number is. And I said, now let's get back to the question. You want to hedge your bets? No. I said, well, what if there's a pandemic like the 1918 flu that killed millions of people around the world? No. And I was told, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, no matter what happens, elect this man, put in his tax cuts, and your incomes will go up. And he said, now when's your story running? It's like 2 weeks before the election. And I said, 10 years. He goes, what? And I said, then we'll have the data, and I'll write about, did it work? I got to go. So here's what happened. I took the average income in 2000 and adjusted it for the number of taxpayers, because there's more people, and for inflation. And the bottom line is, you'll see there are only 2 years where it went up. And you'll notice if you add those two numbers together, they're smaller than every single year, almost every single year. I guess the exception would be 2005. Incomes went down. $6.6 trillion for the average household, $48,500, $10 less income. Well, what could that money have meant? National income not realized, $6.6 trillion. It is enough money, $48,000 per household, that after paying all the taxes, the income taxes and the payroll taxes, we could have paid off every auto loan in America. We could have paid off every credit card debt in America. You'll love the next one. And, not done, you'd have this much money left over. It didn't work. And by the way, there were a whole bunch of us who knew back then it wouldn't work. The Heritage Foundation, remember I mentioned Lewis Powell and the Heritage Foundation? They did a report. They said this tax plan would result in America's America's federal debt being totally paid off by 2007. We'd have no federal debt and we'd be rolling in dough. We didn't get anything close to that. Okay, so how many of you have to leave for a test at 5? Are there any of you? Okay, good. So I'm going to take questions in a minute, but I want to go back to make an underlying fundamental point about things. You're going to choose what you do in your life. My brother is a manual laborer. He decided he liked going to baseball games and chasing girls and drinking beer more than being serious. And he's 62 years old, he's disabled, he lives in a mobile home. I went to work. And even though I had 8 kids, I moved myself from the bottom third of Americans to some years being in the top 1%. You're going to make choices about your life, and you should make the choices that you want to make. That's what freedom is about. But understand you have consequences. My brother got his just desserts, and I got mine. But you're also going to decide whether you're going to be citizens. And the reason we're in the terrible economic straits we are is because too many people aren't citizens. They don't vote, and when they do vote, they vote ideologically. They don't vote pragmatically. They don't pay attention to what's actually happening. And I want to go back and remind you of what I said in the beginning. If you really study tax or public finance and you start listening to what politicians say, read what they say in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and say on television, you will very rapidly see the truth of what I said to you, which is that when you hear politicians and pundits on TV talking about tax, it is only occasionally and incidentally related to reality. We need to have a tax system for the 21st century. If you were the Pharaoh in Egypt and you had a friend, the king of Norway, a couple thousand years ago, if the Pharaoh tried to run his government off the fish catch from the Nile and the king of Norway off the wheat grown on the rocky soil of that country, both governments would fail. But if the Pharaoh takes part of the harvest of wheat, emmer, and if the king of Norway takes part of the cod and the herring, you'll prosper. A tax system must flow from the economic order to promote economic growth and stability and what President Adams called the greatest happiness of the people. We have a tax system which is throwing sand in the gears of commerce. It is giving all the wrong incentives. And most importantly, as I've shown you in the last hour, it takes from the many to redistribute to the few. When someone says Ronald Reagan gave us trickle-down economics, they got it. There was the Democrats who came up with that. They got it totally wrong. It's Niagara up. It's Niagara up. And it is a massive, hidden government program. Government publishes statistics on every dollar that goes to you as students, to children, to the sick, to the disabled, but no statistics about this. And government works very hard to hide this stuff, which is why most people don't know about it. I've spent 20 years of my life helped by other people, including folks who run some groups dedicated to aspects of this, digging this stuff out of the public record, because it is in the public record. You have to decide whether you're going to be serious about being citizens. Whether you're going to just say, oh yeah, I like my congressman. Well, he's draining your pocket. What kind of future you want the children you, if you may already have or may have in the future, to have. What kind of a life you want them to have. And whether you want America to endure. Because if you say, well, the government is dirty, I don't care about that, I'm more, oh please, hey, who's on Dancing with the Stars tonight? If that's what you do, I can tell you what's going to happen. Not going to happen in my lifetime, but it will absolutely happen. Your descendants will sit down in high school history one day, probably as sophomores, and they will open up a book, and it will have a chapter that begins with these words. The United States of America was. Thank you. So I'm going to take questions. I have two rules. One is I'm only going to take questions from students. Sorry, all my fellow gray hairs. Two, ask a question. Don't make a speech. Just think about it and ask the question, okay? So who has a question? In the orange or red there.
So based off of what you're saying, what current country, based off of their tax system, would you think is ideal?
I don't think anybody's ideal, but I think there are some I'm in the process right now of writing a whole new tax code. I'm actually literally drafting a new tax code to address this, and I've delivered a speech that has a big part of it last month to 2,000 trusts and estates lawyers. Better systems than ours, ones that are producing better results than ours, the Germans. They have a jobs problem, but the Germans have produced a better system than we have. The Nordic countries have been very smart. The Nordic countries have regressive taxes to pay for things that everybody uses pretty equally. Healthcare. And then they impose pretty stiff income taxes for things everybody doesn't use to fund the government off those. So basically they've said things that are joint purchases through the government will finance where everybody pays pretty much per capita. Things that are not will fund a different way. And one of the principles we need to have in this country is you should be able to save money and not have, oh, there's a penalty tax if you take it out before age 59 and a half. We have to get rid of that if we want people your age to save money. And that's one of the things that's in my plan. It's called, by the way, it's called the honest tax because everything is ultimately taxed. Sir, are you a student?
I'm a graduate student.
All right, you're in. I teach graduate students at law and business. Go ahead.
About that graph you showed of labor's share of income, I noticed that on the recession bars, at each recession bar, there was a little spike in that.
Yes. During a recession, the people with the biggest incomes, the richest people in America, suffer the most. Their average income in recent years, for example, one year fell from 35 million down to 27 million. And what happens is a greater share of income is to workers because there aren't any capital gains. So whenever there's a recession, labor's share improves temporarily, and the capital share goes down because people take losses. Okay? Who else? Come on, you're students. You should be just brimming with questions in the green shirt.
How much do you think tax cuts for the elites is like caused by lobbying in Congress?
Are the tax cuts for elites caused by lobbying in Congress? Well, until they recently changed the law, there were 35,000 lobbyists in Washington for 535 members of the House and Senate. They run classes you can go take at American University and George Washington University on how to become a lobbyist. Jobs generally start over 6 figures if you can get hired. So you think people spend all that money just for fun? They're mining the public treasury, and it isn't just the tax cuts. But here's a number to keep in mind. Of the Bush tax cuts, 12.5%, that's every 8th dollar, went to the 1 in 1,000 best off households in America. 12.5% of the tax cuts went to 1/10 of 1%. And that top 1/10 of 1%, basically their income starts at around $2 million a year. They have as much income as the bottom 140 million or so Americans. Think about that for a minute. 300,000 Americans at the top have the same income as 140 million. And the people at the top got all the tax cuts. Okay, who else? Over here. You're next. Gonna get some more women? Can we get a little gender diversity here, please? Don't, guys are always, raising their hand. Okay.
How do you get the prospect of income inequality to the public eye and circumvent the issue of the rhetoric of class warfare?
Well, okay. How do you get this to the public eye and circumvent the class warfare issue? You know what Warren Buffett told me, and I quoted him in the New York Times as saying years ago? There is class warfare in America, and my side's winning. There is class warfare. Everybody at the top who's rich doesn't mean they hate people or they're doing things. I mean, the Koch brothers believe their stuff, okay? And they're personally very generous guys. I mean, I happen to know what one of them tips his caddy when he plays golf, and it's very generous. He can afford to be. I know other people who are very rich who don't. And a lot of my best sources are very wealthy people who own their own jets and tell me about things. But there is a class warfare issue. What's wrong with advocating for your class? Why should you say, I work in a factory, I should just shut up? I'm a waitress. Oh, guys, think that if they leave a tip, they can pinch my bottom. I should just shut up and take it. Advocate for yourself. That's the whole idea of a democracy, is we advocate for ourselves. I'll let you follow up, and then you. And then a woman somewhere who's a student.
I meant less of class warfare itself and more of the rhetoric problem of phrasing.
I think you just ignore it and write about what the facts are and tell people what the facts are and get them to hear them. And because the facts are pretty compelling. And part of the problem is, look, most people in my business accurately quote what people they talk to tell them. The problem is most of them have never taken a course in public administration, government finance, corporate management. They don't know how systems work. And so they can't question things, and very, very few reporters do what I do, which is act on their own authority. I mean, maybe it's arrogant, but I've never had people say to me, you should go write about this. I say to editors, I found this out, we should write about it. So, I'm going to call on one of you women if you don't see some hands up soon. All right.
Is taxation ethical?
Is taxation ethical? Is taxation, well, first of all, if you think it isn't ethical, then the Constitution isn't ethical. I mean, taxation is the government. And
I mean, is it ethical?
Why wouldn't it be ethical?
I mean, shouldn't you try to apply ethics to government?
Sure. Well, I'm sorry, I'm completely dumbfounded by the question. If you're an anarchist, the question makes sense. How are you going to fund government? You came here on a road, right, from wherever you grew up? How are you going to pay for the road? You're at a school the taxpayers paid for because we get a return. We educate you, and you produce the economy, and we're all better off. What's the issue?
Well, are you saying that government can only create roads? Are they the only ones?
The private market could create roads. Anybody here think if the private market created roads, we'd have the roads we have today?
My question was just
Yeah.
if government was ethical.
I think government is ethical because without government, you live in the jungle, and I don't think the jungle's at all ethical. The tiger doesn't care when he slices you apart. If you were a rich person and your band of thugs protecting your fortune wasn't big enough to stop another band of thugs, let me tell you what happened in the ancient world. They would tie you up and take your daughters and rape them in front of you and then peel their skin off in front of you and make you watch them die. Then they would take your sons and they would dismember them alive in front of you, or burn them in a cage, or maybe put them in the golden calf and boil and burn them alive like a piece of meat. And then when they were all done with your wife and everybody else, they would impale you. Go read up on how impaling works and let you spend 3 days on the spike until you died. That's what's not ethical. You had a question.
So you were talking about the Athenian system and how it was about taxation. Well, I know that the Roman system was about a bunch of the richest 1%, that their job was to do all the public works and to do the generous to society. Do you think that it would be necessarily a bad thing to move to...
You raise a really good point. In both ancient Athens and in Rome, the wealthy who were heavily taxed were also honored. You did a festival. You paid for the warship and your name was put on it. And you were hailed. And the Athenians had a simple form of auditing tax returns. The next richest person was always picked to pay for the next public festival or the building of a warship. So if the government came to me and I went, no, the government should have come to you. You could do one of two things. Can you stand up, Professor? Thank you. You can do one of two things. You can either take the obligation or exchange your fortune with me. You're going to take the obligation because you think you're richer than I am. Now, if you do that and you have intelligence and you know what's going on, you might get rich, and if you have bad intelligence, you might go broke. But it was an early form of that. I think we should give some serious thought to whether we want to set up some kind of a system where we honor people for their taxes. I think that would be a good idea. We need to stop this notion that wealth is a bad thing. We want everybody to be better off. Okay? What we don't want is for people to get rich by draining your pocket. All right, one other woman here. Come on. Female student somewhere. Oh, there we are.
Do you think it's possible that Obama's promise to start taxing offshore profits from companies will ever gain footing? And if it's not possible, how should we go about changing that?
So President Obama proposed a 19% tax on offshore profits. I sure hope it doesn't happen because it's a giveaway of tens of billions of dollars to these companies. Okay? It is not at all what you heard about from reporters, and those people who understand what he's proposed have written about it. You can see it in various journals and other places where people actually understand tax have written about it. It's a terrible, terrible idea. Whether we should have a territorial tax or not, well, here's the problem with the territorial tax. All those big companies that are making money off the tax system, they don't want it because they'd stop making profits off their taxes. And why would you give up a profit center? And by the way, when I originally broke the story of this in, I think, January of 2002 on the front page of the New York Times, my editors were very disbelieving of this. We got a couple of people to tell them I was right about it. And the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation staff, using my story, got approval to do a study. They basically said, we'll prove he's wrong. And the study came back, 1,800 pages, 4 volumes, and it showed that Enron literally stamped the documents of its tax department with a big rubber stamp that said, profit center. Profit center. So, but anyway, here's a terrible plan. All right, one more woman. Oh, all right.
So you talked about both the inadequacy of the corporate tax structure as well as the personal individual structure. So which would be the best to tackle first?
I believe the tax system is such a mess that we have to just start with a fresh sheet of paper, and that's what I'm doing in my plan, The Honest Tax. One of the things that Professor Gramlich and I have been talking about is the issues that will arise if you get rid of the corporate income tax. There are 6 million corporations in America. 2,800 of them own 81% of the assets. 2,800 out of 6 million. But you can't just stop taxing them, or literally you will destroy the economy. And think about why. And you'll after a while, if you can't figure it out, your professors in accounting or business will explain it to you. But I think you have to start with a clean slate. One of the things I'll tell you something I tell my students. We could run the whole economy off metered things. Tax electricity, water, sewage. Coal is metered, it's just done by the ton in the rail car. Gasoline, we could just switch to that system and just tax those things. It creates all sorts of problems, but we could do it. So there are all sorts of things we can do because the Constitution gives Congress an unlimited power to tax. I mean, I actually talked to a scholar who believes that it wouldn't be unreasonable, given what we know about health, to put a meter on every person and tax you based on your rate of respiration. Because if you're in good shape, you breathe less often. Okay. Now, this gentleman up here had a question.
If you could just give us an idea of the biggest change you would make to the current taxation system.
What's the biggest change that I would make? I would see to it that all income is taxed. George Steinbrenner, the guy who owns the Yankees, and who owes his entire fortune to ripping off the government. He got $400 million to build 2 warships, the hulks of which are sitting somewhere, because he never built them, whereas the other contractor brought his ships in under budget and on time. He died in 2010. There was no estate tax. So his entire fortune was passed tax-free. I got the Romney campaign in December of 2011 in writing to acknowledge that the trust fund for their sons, $100 million in it, which was created when the most you could give your children without paying gift tax was $1.2 million, that no gift tax was paid on the trust fund. And I wrote a column explaining how this happened, I mean, we don't literally know how they did it, but I'm pretty sure I know the mechanism they used to do this. All gains above the minimum level needed for life, as Adam Smith taught, should be taxed. And very wealthy people should not be allowed to pass money forward that will never be taxed. And that's a big part of the ballgame. In 1996, you can go read front page of the New York Times, October 13th, 1996, I wrote about how the head of the Coca-Cola company had been paid $100 million for 1 year's work 5 years earlier. And this had been a big news story. The New York Times broke it, ran all over the world, it was on TV, it was like a $100 million paycheck, because at that point nobody had ever heard of that. And what my article pointed out was he'd never paid taxes on that money. He had worked out a deal, and it turned out it wasn't just him. Jack Welch at GE and the guy who ran American Express and IBM and Allied Signal, they all had the same deal. They weren't paying taxes on the money. So the gentleman with the beard I met earlier today. One more?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, you're the last one.
You don't seem to have a lot of confidence in the political parties that are currently established to address income inequality. Is idealistic blind populism the answer?
Here's what I think members of Congress respond. I've interviewed over 100 members of Congress and the Senate about fundraising. They all find it demeaning and awful. My wife came home one day. She's a CEO, and she had been asked about running for Congress. And she was thinking, that's pretty cool, you know? I mean, you probably think so too, right? And I sat down and said, well, sweetheart, I just want you to think about, and I named some people we know who she doesn't particularly care for, and said, you know, you'd have to go to them to raise money and promise you were going to get them the things they want. And she went, yeah, I'm not running for Congress. And that's terrible. We should have people running for Congress and not running for that kind of reason. They shouldn't be saying, oh, I can't run for Congress because I cheated on my husband 4 years ago and it will come out, my opponents will bring it. It's just nonsense. We shouldn't have that stuff. The solution to all of this, I believe, is that the American people have to decide to get serious about politics. And if they decide they're going to invest in being citizens, then the incentives will change, incumbents will get voted out, we'll get a new Congress, not everybody will be perfect, you know, nothing is perfect, but we will have a Congress that's much more responsive to people. Jeff, let me take one more. All right, you smiled nicely, go ahead.
Do you know who you're voting for in the next presidential election?
No. I'll tell you what I can tell you. I mean, I'm a registered Republican, by the way. All sorts of people are sort of surprised by that. But they say to the party, the big tent, I'm a Teddy Roosevelt Republican, and I've never gotten to vote for anyone for President of the United States who I was happy about getting to vote for. If Elizabeth Warren, whom I've known for 25 years, and who I think is the most extraordinary public servant, ran for president, I'd vote for her. If Al Franken, who's a really good senator, very smart guy, ran for president, not going to happen, I'd be happy to vote for him. But parties don't put up, you don't get to run for president at a high level if Wall Street doesn't back you. I mean, look what happened to John Huntsman, billionaire scion of a family who has pretty good ideas in my view of the world. I mean, I don't agree about all of them, but he's in a ballpark of reality and sensibility. He couldn't raise any money. You don't get to run at a high level if Goldman Sachs doesn't like you. So, well, thank you. Thank you, Jeff.